So I just got done reading Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. This is probably one of my first experiences with reading African literature. I'd heard about it in the past. I heard it's really famous like novel, a Nigerian classic. But no, I read it, and it was honestly different to what I imagined, because basically what I had anticipated when I went into it would be sort of because I just finished Heart of Darkness. I thought it'd sort of mainly just be about colonialism. It'd be basically, I imagined it would just be, you know, like, I don't know, people in the village, the white man comes and attacks, and then everything sucks afterwards. But it wasn't. Basically, for the first 100 pages of the 100 pages of the novel, the book is basically just about just Nigerian society. I mean, the book's very short. It's only about 150 pages for the edition that I read. And the first 100 pages are just really detailing sort of the Nigerian, and specifically the Igbo way of life. Because I know in Nigeria, I think there's the Igbo, there's the Yoruba, the Hausa. So it's like, there's lots of different groups of people. But for Things Fall Apart, it's specifically about Igbo people and their way of life. And it gets into a lot of this, like, stuff like the shamanic tradition, the rituals of life, sort of, just the way society was, like, sort of, and the way it had always been, for all of history over there. And so basically, so it's in a village, um, in sort of, again, what is now Nigeria, and it's called the village of, and I apologize because I'm gonna butcher some of the names. I'm trying my best, but viewer discretion is advised. So it's in a place called Morphia, which is a village, but it's part of a like wider clan. So this clan made up a lot of these like Igbo villages, and so it begins with this guy. Introduced to the main character, who's called Okonkwo, and he's really like a really famed wrestler. You know, this really masculine sort of like what you can think of as like a really traditional kind of patriarch kind of figure. He's a great wrestler, a great warrior. He has I think 5 heads from war just outside his house, showing how good he is. And basically, what happens is that when he grows up, he comes from a really bad like household. It's really like a rags to riches story, but in a different setting. So it begins with Okonkwo and his father Unoka, who is lazy and he gambles. He gets immense debts, and it's shown with this little part at the start where one of the guys comes back to collect debts from him. He wants to collect, I think it's 200 calories from Unoka, and he says basically, "I can't pay you back." There's a guy I owe 1,000 calories. I can't even pay that yet, so I'm gonna go pay him first. Like don't even think about it, you're not gonna get your money back. And Minoka, although he is sort of seen as this lazy guy, he's very talented with the flute, but he doesn't really do anything with the family. And so Okonkwo basically sort of becomes the man of the house. He starts to and he thinks that there's this thing called like chi, I think, or kai, or I don't know how to, but it's supposed to be kind of like fate or destiny. And the whole thing is that while Unoka kind of lets it go, he doesn't say yes to his chi. Okonkwo does, and he sort of manifests his destiny. I know that's the absolute worst way to put it, but he does. He basically just like um he thinks to himself, well, I'm going to take hold of my own future. I'm not going to let some bad luck that was prescribed to me by birth sort of put me down. And so he proves himself. He works extremely hard while everyone is lazy. He's out there, like clearing fields so he can grow crops. He borrows seeds from one of the elite men in the village, and he says like, You know, can I please? I have nothing. My father has nothing. He has no yams. I'm gonna have to start all this myself. Can I please borrow some seeds and like do some sharecropping, where I give you like a third, and you um, let me grow on your land. Not grow on let you grow on my land, but using your yam seeds. And so after, years pass, he becomes this, he does all this stuff, and then uh, Okonkwo through basically sheer effort becomes like an elder figure in Umofia. He takes on three wives, which they kind of go into details about. I can't remember all three wives' names, even though I just read it. But basically, there's so the one that most common, like they talk about in the book, is his second wife, Ekwefi, and her daughter Enzima, which who Okonkwo sees as sort of his successor if she wasn't a girl. He sees everything good in himself and her. But unfortunately, because of the really, and that's something that's really emphasized in the book, is the harsh gender roles. Gender roles are established very heavily. The woman in the book basically just is relegated to just cooking and having kids. They cook for the man. They have child. They do all the chores, and the man basically goes out and they grow, their own little fields, their own crops of like beans and stuff. And then, but the man grows the main crop. He grows the yam required for the fufu, which is like a big thing in the book, like the pounding of the fufu, which is like because that's like a staple there. And so, and that's what's emphasized, in lots of in the book. Lots of it revolves around sort of this kind of ancient way of life. It's like this way of life that's been going on cyclically for millennia. Goes around, the seasons, the harvesting of crops. It goes into traditions of Igbo society. It has, this like, you know, what's it? Whenever guests come over, they break open the kola nut and they drink out of goatskin bags. There are things like, pounding fufu becomes like a ritual to pair with a goosey soup. And, it's also clear that looking at it from a Western point of view, and that's the kind of thing that's weird, is when you go into the book, you sort of go into this curve where you go in from this kind of really Western point of view, but as you become immersed into this culture and all the characters, you sort of you sort of you shift into this, I would say like you shift completely into like Nigerian, this Igbo point of view, but you do sort of like you don't become as tethered to your Western ideas. Like when I went into this, first thing I thought was, okay, well, Okonkwo is a very, very sort of harsh husband. He whenever his children or his wives do anything, that's a slight misdemeanor, like he beats like the crap out of them. And he doesn't really show much love in the sense, now it's like saying I love you, hugs, and like no, no, no. He doesn't show much love, but he does provide and he cares for his family. And there's also other parts that seem kind of messed up again from that Western point of view. The stuff with like the shamanic tradition. So there are parts of the stories, including there's parts that involve the mutilation of dead babies. There's like this whole part where, uh, especially with Ekwefi, I think her like backstory is that she's had lots of miscarriages in the past, and lots of the elders in the tribe have said, well, I said it's called because of demon babies, and so like what happens is when a baby comes out and is sort of rejected, they kind of like they label it a demon baby and they throw it in the evil forest, sort of away from the village, and they mutilate the body to make sure that it doesn't come back. And it seems kind of messed up, at the start, and it also involves rejecting twins also at the same time altogether. But there's also this sort of sense to it that makes sense in a way. Like there's a sort of cycle of like of sacrifice and rebirth that like even though some of the traditions may seem outdated or may seem wrong, they start to feel kind of right as you sort of, as the story progresses. There's another part of the story that also becomes a major plot point, is the murder of the son that Okonkwo takes on and raises himself after a war, I think, or something. Basically, this kid, Ikene Mefu, he becomes taken on as like, I don't know, like a war prisoner. But anyways, Okonkwo raises him as a son, and just random, and he becomes really close with Okonkwo's own son, Noye, and basically like what happens is they get really close, but then one day, the village elders, I think it's called the Egugu, basically just said, right, your son needs to die. This is Mother Earth has, ordained this. This is just what has to happen. And so while, Okonkwo is sort of reluctant initially, he also knows he can't go against the will of the earth and the will of these these spirits. And so basically he just lets him die. And that sort of sears itself into Neuer's mind, and that becomes, problematic later. And so, life goes on. There's the details of village life, kind of all this, all this stuff like Enzima gets sick. That becomes sort of a plot point, and she is taken by the priestess of Agala, I think, to a cave and blah blah blah, and then she comes back better. And there's also parts like, marriage, like the son of Oberika gets engaged to I think Maduka, and I think they get engaged to a girl called Aquele. And basically, and there's wrestling. Anyways, that's just like, so there's that whole part. So that's kind of like the first part. It's in three parts, but it's sort of in two acts. The first act is just old Nigerian society, the way it's always been. And then afterwards, uh, sort of in the last 50 pages is when colonialism begins. So basically, firstly, Okonkwo is exiled after a funeral because he accidentally shoots a guy in like sort of their funeral in the funeral rites. So in the funeral rites, basically what they do to honor the dead is they shoot guns and to like put on a real show for the dead warrior. But then I think his gun accidentally misfires and shrapnel kills uh, one of the uh, one of the children of the deceased. And so basically, reluctantly, the village is like, well, you've spilled you know blood from our own village, so you must be exiled. And so Alconco is forced to return to his motherland and live there with his children and his wife for 7 years. But meanwhile, during this time, what happens is colonialism begins. And so he hears stories about sort of, there's this village called Abame. And what happens is, like the white man defends. He comes on an iron horse and basically says, you must accept our religion, blah, blah, blah. The residents of Abame say no. They kill the guy and they tie up his horse. And then what happens is that Abame basically gets razed to the ground. Everyone gets killed. It's gone afterwards. And so Conco's like, these guys are pussies. Like, these nah, that wouldn't happen to me. And so he goes back, but then he realizes that the arrival of the white man has changed society completely. Now the church basically dominates, and lots of the parts where the elders would normally do. So when Okonkwo goes back, even though he quickly builds himself up back to a position of power, he realizes that the church basically, through its education of locals, that it basically indoctrinates half of like of the village. Many of the sort of lower levels of society all gravitate to the church, which gives them immense powers and protects them. And so it disrupts the sort of natural order of things, of strong and weak, sort of living in harmony. Now the church kind of props up the people who were once weak, make them strong. And so, and there's lots of parts that sort of symbolize this like this disruption of the national order. The church, they build their church in the evil forest. Initially, it's done as a joke. They offer the land, the Igbo elders, they offer the land of the evil forest because they imagine that no one would ever take the land. There's dead babies and stuff buried there. But the church doesn't care. They don't know about this, and so they build it, and then eventually, they don't get cursed, like unlike what people believe, and that sort of changes how people think. And so more and more people start gravitating towards the church, including Okonkwo's own son, Noye, who hates his father for being a part of Ikemenefu's death. And he joins sort of the leader of the church. I think there's this white guy, I don't remember his name, switches. And this African Christian, I think his name's Dr. Kiaga or Mr. Kiaga. And basically, you know, basically the entire society is sort of flipped around. And the church keeps trying to press and push. Like they keep trying to mess with like sort of regular traditions. They keep saying, "Oh, the gods that you pray to are pagan. They're just wooden objects. This is just, you're not praying to a real god." Like, and even though there's a great part where one of the people from Umofia kind of says, "Well, no, our system actually works pretty similar to you. We have our greater god, but lots of our other gods, like our medium sort of level, our gods that are like embody, different sort of like celebrations and stuff like that. All these lower gods actually serve to the higher god, just like you. We have this big one, but then we have sort of lower levels to it that do his bidding." And the Christian guy, he doesn't accept it. He's like, whatever, whatever, wyou guys say, is wrong. It's all like blah 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 blah. There's another part of disrupting the natural order where um there's this whole part about the royal snake being killed. And basically, the guy who kills the royal snake, he's just like low level guy. And the royal snake, after the royal snake gets killed, he gets no punishment from the church, and the church doesn't allow anyone to punish him. Even though he dies, it just shows how again the natural order is subverted, and and then another part where like I think another guy I think kills Anagugu or like removes his mask because they wear masks and kills his spirit, and he's also not disciplined. And so everything has gone topsy turvy. And so the elders, they're like, nah, this is not it. We're going to go reason with the people in the church and tell the people in the church, they're like, you got to go. I don't care. We're not going to kill you, but your church is going to go. They raise the church to the ground, and then they get they get arrested and they get beaten, they get tortured. After they let go, they say, nah, we're going for a rebellion. And so rebellion is inside, and Okonkwo kills the messenger. But because he doesn't kill all of them, they go off, and then all the missionaries and the new government that's been established come to look out, come to find these people, and they find out that Okonkwo has hanged himself, and he dies a warrior's death instead of being killed by the white man, as an example. And so, I think that's the rough summary. But I think rather than a story about the horrors of colonialism in the same vein as Heart of Darkness, the emphasis of Things Fall Apart isn't on the terror of colonialism in the destructive, apocalyptic sense, literally, chaining these people, but instead, like sort of culture and humanity of people becoming colonized and being shifted, rather than that abstract kind of idea of Darkest Africa. Achebe details the way of life of the Igbo so realistically that when the colonizers come, the reader inevitably feels like, like he basically gets you into this sort of Igbo way of thinking that you think, oh wait, you kind of understand why they resisted colonization so much because it feels so wrong. Like the whole thing, like the idea of just the colonization just feels so like this religion is basically forced on these people who are living fine. Like their life was all good. There's a natural order to things, and then they kind of forced people into accepting something new and flipping over sort of society of the people who'd worked hard to their position. And so yeah, so I think it was a great book. I'd highly recommend it. Again, it's really short. It's not long. It's like maybe I think I read it combined in 5 hours, 4 or 5 hours, and that wasn't even particularly fast. So highly recommend the book. I'd like to check out more in the same vein in the future. But yeah, that's it.